The letter had been forwarded 6 times. 6 homeless shelters across 4 states, each one scrawling a new address over the old, until the envelope looked like a map of everywhere Elias Vance had tried to disappear. He stood at the edge of a gravel road in rural Montana, boots held together with duct tape and faith, reading words that made no sense. His brother Hank was dead. The same brother who had called him a murderer 40 years ago for choosing the Marines over family. The same brother who had refused to speak to him at their mother's funeral. That brother had left him everything. 40 acres of mountain wilderness in a cabin that Elias had never seen, had never been invited to see, was now his. The only shelter he had been offered in 6 years of wandering. And standing there in clothes that smelled of wood smoke and desperation, Elias Vance had no idea that accepting this inheritance would force him to become the man he had spent 6 years trying to forget. The trucker who had given him a ride from Missoula pulled away with a wave, leaving Elias alone on a road that disappeared into pine forests and shadow. He folded the letter carefully, precisely, the way he folded everything, and tucked it into the pocket of his torn jacket beside the only 2 possessions that mattered. A photograph of a young man in a graduation gown, his son Micah, taken 7 years ago on the last day Elias had allowed himself to be a father. And a simple gold ring on a leather cord, worn smooth by years of being touched in the darkness when the memories became too heavy to carry alone. His wife Catherine had been wearing that ring when she died. Cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to funeral, and somewhere in those 18 months, Elias Vance had shattered into pieces that he still had not figured out how to reassemble. He began walking toward the mountain, his gait steady despite the rough terrain, his eyes automatically scanning the tree line and patterns he had learned in places where missing a shadow meant dying. The habits of 40 years did not fade simply because a man had lost everything else. His hands, scarred and weathered, hung loose at his sides, but there was an economy to his movements that seemed out of place for a homeless drifter. A precision that whispered of training most people would never understand. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. These mountains might remind you of somewhere in your own backyard. And if stories of veterans finding their way home speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now let's see what Elias finds up that mountain road. 3 miles. That was the distance from the main road to the cabin, according to the lawyer's letter. 3 miles of logging road that had not seen maintenance in a decade, climbing steadily into the Bitterroot Range where the air thinned and the silence grew teeth. Elias had walked farther on less sleep and worse conditions, but something about this walk felt different, heavier, like he was not just approaching a cabin, but approaching a decision he had been running from for years. The smell hit him first, pine and cold granite, and something else underneath, something mechanical. Diesel fuel, fresh diesel fuel on a road that supposedly led to an abandoned cabin. He stopped walking. His body shifted almost imperceptibly, weight settling lower, shoulders squaring in a way that would have meant nothing to a civilian, but would have told any combat veteran that the man in the torn jacket had just become something other than a homeless drifter. Tire tracks, fresh ones, cutting through the mud and pine needles, leading up the mountain. Multiple vehicles, heavy ones within the last few days. Someone was using his brother's land. Someone who had no right to be there. Elias could have turned around, could have walked back to the main road, hitched another ride, disappeared into another city where no one knew his name or his past or the weight he carried. He had done it before. He had become an expert at vanishing. But something in him had grown tired of running. Something that had started to stir when he read his brother's letter, when he realized that Hank had forgiven him after 40 years of silence. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found a place worth standing for. He left the road and melted into the forest, moving through the underbrush without sound, without trace, the way he had learned to move in the mountains of Afghanistan when silence meant survival. The trees welcomed him like old friends. The shadows wrapped around him like a cloak he had never truly taken off. Elias Vance had spent 30 years as one of the deadliest snipers in Marine Corps history. Call sign Wraith, because by the time enemies saw him, they were already dead. He had retired that identity, buried it under years of grief and wandering in shame. But as he climbed higher into the Bitterroots, following tire tracks that led to trouble, he could feel the Wraith stirring awake. Ahead, through the trees, the sound of laughter. Male voices, rough and confident, the sound of men who believed they owned whatever ground they stood on. And then another sound, a rifle shot, followed by screaming that was almost human. An animal, wounded and suffering while the laughter continued. Elias moved closer, patient and invisible, and what he saw in the clearing ahead made his jaw tighten with cold fury. This was his land now, his brother's last gift, and someone was about to learn that they had made a terrible mistake by being here. The elk was still alive. That was the first thing Elias registered as he watched from the shadows of the tree line, close enough to see everything but invisible to the men in the clearing. The animal lay on its side, massive chest heaving, blood pooling beneath wounds that had been placed with deliberate cruelty. Not kill shots, suffering shots, the kind of marksmanship that required skill but lacked any trace of honor. 7 men stood in a loose circle around the dying animal. 4 of them wore expensive tactical gear that had never seen real combat, the kind of equipment wealthy men purchased to feel dangerous without understanding what danger actually meant. They held rifles that cost more than most families earned in a month, and they were laughing, taking photographs, posing with the creature that was bleeding out at their feet. The other 3 men were different. They stood apart from the clients, scanning the perimeter with eyes that recognized threat, hands resting on sidearms with the casual readiness of professionals. Security contractors, former military, judging by their bearing, though Elias could tell from their spacing and their lazy attention that they had grown comfortable. Overconfident, the kind of men who had seen enough action to think they understood violence, but not enough to respect it. One man stood at the center of it all, and Elias knew immediately that this was the one in charge. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket that probably cost more than the cabin Elias had just inherited. His voice carried across the clearing with the easy authority of someone who had never been told no. "You see, gentlemen," the man was saying, gesturing toward the suffering elk with a half-empty whiskey glass, "the sport is not in the kill. Any fool can kill. The sport is in the fear, in the suffering, in making them understand what is happening to them before the end." One of the clients laughed nervously. "Is it not more humane to just finish it quickly, Garrett?" The man called Garrett smiled, and there was something cold in that smile that made Elias's hands tighten at his sides. "Humane is for people who lack imagination. We are not here for humane, Thomas. We are here for the experience. And I promise you, by the time this weekend is over, you will understand the difference." He raised a pistol and fired a single shot into the elk's hindquarters. The animal screamed, a sound that echoed off the mountains and settled into Elias's chest like a weight. The clients flinched, but Garrett just took another sip of whiskey and smiled. Elias had seen cruelty before. He had seen it in the eyes of men who tortured prisoners for information, in the casual brutality of warlords who ruled through fear, in the cold calculation of enemies who used children as shields. He had learned to compartmentalize that cruelty, to file it away in the parts of his mind where nightmares lived, to keep moving forward because the mission required it. But watching this, watching wealthy men pay for the privilege of causing suffering on land that his brother had loved, something old and cold began to stir in Elias Vance. Something he had thought he buried with his wife. He cataloged the threats automatically. 7 men, 3 of them trained and armed. 2 approaches to the clearing, both exposed. The security team carried SIG Sauer pistols and what looked like AR-15 variants, civilian models modified for accuracy. Good equipment, poorly utilized. They were watching the tree line in theory, but not in practice, their attention split between their clients and the spectacle of suffering before them. The one called Cade, A thick-necked man with a military haircut going gray at the temples seemed the most capable of the three. He stood slightly apart from the others, his eyes moving in patterns that suggested actual training, his body positioned to respond to threats from multiple directions. Former Special Operations, Elias guessed. Maybe a Ranger or a Marine. Someone who had been good once, but had let civilian life soften his edges. Elias could take them. The thought came unbidden, a calculation made by the part of his brain that had never stopped being a sniper. Cade first, because he was the only real threat. Then the other two security men before they could react. The clients would scatter, and frightened men with expensive rifles were more dangerous to themselves than to anyone else. He could end this in under 30 seconds. But ending it would mean becoming the Wraith again. It would mean letting the monster out of the cage he had built for it, and Elias was not certain he could put it back. He chose a different path. He would circle around the clearing, approach the cabin from the north, establish what he was dealing with before making any decisions. His brother's property, his brother's cabin, his brother's last gift. He needed to understand the scope of the problem before he decided how to solve it. He began to move, sliding through the forest with the patience of a man who had once spent 4 days motionless in a single position, waiting for a target that never came. Each step was placed with deliberate care, weight transferring slowly to avoid any sound that might carry. The shadows welcomed him, folding around his body like they remembered what he used to be. He was 50 meters from the clearing when his boot came down on a branch hidden beneath a layer of pine needles. The crack was small, barely louder than a whisper, but in the silence of the mountain forest it might as well have been a gunshot. Cade's head snapped toward the sound. His hand moved to his sidearm with speed that confirmed Elias's assessment of his training. For a long moment, the two men stared at the same patch of forest, one seeing nothing but shadows, the other invisible within them. Garrett's voice cut through the tension. "What is it?" "Heard something," Cade replied, his eyes still scanning. "Probably just an animal." "Then go check. I do not want any surprises this weekend. We have too much invested to have some hikers stumbling into our operation." Cade nodded and began moving toward the tree line, drawing his pistol as he walked. Behind him, one of the other security men followed, rifle unslung and ready. Elias did not move, did not breathe. He became what he had always been in moments like this, a shadow, a ghost, a wraith. The men passed within 10 feet of his position and saw nothing but trees and darkness. But as Cade passed, Elias saw the man's eyes catch on something. A footprint barely visible in the soft earth. Fresh, leading up the mountain. Cade's voice was quiet when he spoke into his radio. "We have a problem, boss. Someone has been watching us. And based on these tracks, they're still close." Garrett's response carried clearly through the forest, cold and certain. "Then find them. And when you do, make sure they understand that no one leaves this mountain without my permission." Elias moved through the forest like water flowing downhill, finding the paths of least resistance, the shadows that swallowed light, the angles that kept trees between himself and his pursuers. Behind him, he could hear Cade and the other security man crashing through the underbrush with the confidence of men who believed numbers and weapons were enough to guarantee victory. They were wrong. They had been wrong the moment they decided to hunt a man who had spent 30 years teaching the mountains of 3 continents to hide him. He led them away from the cabin first, drawing them east toward a ravine he had spotted from the road. Let them chase shadows while he circled back. Let them exhaust themselves on terrain that would punish every mistake. The Bitterroots were not forgiving to men who did not respect them, and Elias intended to use every advantage the land offered. The ravine opened before him, a 40-foot drop into a creek bed choked with fallen timber and loose stone. He descended without hesitation, finding handholds that seemed to materialize beneath his fingers, his body remembering movements it had learned in the Hindu Kush when falling meant death and stillness meant survival. At the bottom, he crossed the creek in 3 precise steps, placing his feet on stones that would hold no prints, leaving no trace of his passage. Above him, he heard Cade's voice, frustrated and wary. "Lost him. Tracks just disappear at the edge." The other man's response was dismissive. Probably some homeless drifter who got scared and ran. Nobody important. Cade did not respond immediately, and Elias paused in the shadows of an overhang to listen. When the security man finally spoke, there was something in his voice that had not been there before. Something that sounded almost like doubt. I do not think so. The way he moved through here, the way he placed his feet. That is not how civilians walk. That is how operators walk. Someone trained this guy, and they trained him well. So what? You think we have some kind of special forces hobo out here? I think we need to be careful. That is what I think. Elias allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Cade was smarter than he looked. That would make him more dangerous, but it also meant he might be smart enough to convince the others to leave before anyone got hurt. He circled north, climbing out of the ravine a quarter-mile upstream where the walls had crumbled into a navigable slope. The cabin should be close now, just over the next ridge, and he needed to see it before dark. Needed to understand what he was dealing with, what resources his brother had left behind, what options he had beyond disappearing into another city and letting these men have what they had already taken. The forest thinned as he climbed, giving way to a clearing that opened onto a view that stopped him in his tracks. The cabin sat at the edge of a meadow, backed by granite cliffs that rose another 1,000 feet toward peaks still crowned with snow. It was smaller than he had imagined, a simple structure of logs and stone that had weathered decades of mountain winters, but there was a solidity to it that spoke of careful construction. His brother had built this place to last, built it to survive. Smoke rose from a metal chimney, thin and lazy in the still air. Lights glowed behind curtained windows. Someone was inside. Elias approached from the blind side, using the cliffs as cover, moving from shadow to shadow until he could see through a gap in the curtains. The interior was Spartan but well-maintained, a single room dominated by a wood stove and a wall of bookshelves. Maps covered one wall, topographical surveys of the surrounding wilderness, marked with notations in handwriting he recognized as his brother's. A rifle rack held 3 weapons, old but serviceable, the kind of tools a man kept for practicality rather than sport. And on a small table beside the door, a photograph in a simple wooden frame. 2 boys standing in front of a farmhouse, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the easy joy of children who did not yet understand how the world would try to break them. Elias remembered that photograph. Remembered the day it was taken, the summer before their father died, the last summer when everything had still made sense. He had been 12. Hank had been 15. And neither of them had known that in 5 years, a war would tear them apart in ways that 40 years could not heal. His brother had kept that photograph, had looked at it every day in this cabin he had built alone in the mountains, had thought about the brother he had pushed away, the words he had never been able to take back. The letter in Elias's pocket felt heavier than it had before. A sound from the clearing pulled him back to the present. Engines, multiple vehicles, approaching from the logging road. Headlights cut through the gathering dusk, and voices carried on the cold air. Garrett's hunting party had returned to what they clearly considered their base of operations. Elias watched from the shadows as 3 SUVs pulled into the meadow. The clients climbed out first, laughing and passing bottles, already drunk on whiskey and the memory of suffering they had caused. The security team followed, spreading out to check the perimeter with the casual attention of men who did not expect to find anything. Garrett emerged last, speaking into a satellite phone with the easy authority of someone accustomed to giving orders across continents. His voice carried clearly in the mountain silence. "No, we're fine here. Just a minor complication. Some vagrant wandering through the property. My men are handling it. The clients are satisfied, and we have 3 more days of hunting scheduled before we pack out. Everything is under control." He ended the call and turned to survey the clearing, his eyes passing over the cabin with proprietary satisfaction. This land had not belonged to him, had never belonged to him, but he had taken it anyway, because men like Garrett believed that ownership was determined by power rather than right. Elias felt something cold settle into his chest, something that had been sleeping for 6 years, waiting for a reason to wake. These men had desecrated his brother's land, had used it for cruelty and sport while Hank lay dying somewhere far away, unable to protect what he had built. They had assumed that because no one was watching, no one would ever hold him accountable. They were wrong. Elias withdrew into the forest, patient and silent, his mind already calculating approaches and angles, resources and limitations. He would not confront them tonight, would not reveal himself until he understood exactly what he was facing. But as he found a sheltered position with clear sight lines to the cabin and the clearing below, he made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. He was not going to run. Not this time. This was his land now, his brother's last gift. And he would defend it the way he had defended 100 positions in 100 hostile places across the world. The Wraith was awake, and by the time these men understood what that meant, it would already be too late. The night grew cold in the way only mountain nights can, the temperature dropping fast enough that Elias could see his breath forming clouds in the darkness. He did not move from his position, did not allow himself the luxury of discomfort. He had spent nights far colder than this in places far more dangerous, and the habits of survival did not fade simply because the enemy below him was drinking whiskey instead of planning ambushes. He watched the cabin until the lights went out, until the security team completed their final perimeter check and retreated to the warmth of their vehicles. He counted bodies and weapons, noted schedules and patterns, filed away every detail that might matter when the confrontation came. And in the spaces between observations, he allowed himself to remember. Catherine had been the one who taught him how to stop being a weapon. They met in San Diego in 1994, 6 months after he returned from a deployment he still could not talk about. He had been sitting alone at a bar near Pendleton, drinking with the methodical determination of a man trying to drown something that refused to die, when she sat down beside him and ordered a glass of wine with the confidence of someone who did not belong in a place like that. "You look like you're trying to disappear," she had said, not looking at him, just stating a fact the way she stated everything, with clarity and precision and absolutely no judgment. "Maybe I am," he had replied. She had turned then, and her eyes had found his, and something in the way she looked at him made him feel seen for the first time in years. Not the uniform, not the ribbons, not the classified history that had turned him into something the Corps pointed at enemies and pulled the trigger. Just him, just Elias. "That seems lonely," she had said. "Disappearing." "It is." "Then maybe you should try something else." He had not known what to say to that. Had not known that in 3 years she would become his wife, that in 5 years she would give him a son, that in 23 years she would die in a hospital bed while he held her hand and begged God for a miracle that never came. The memory of her face in those final hours still cut like shrapnel. The way her skin had gone pale, the way her breathing had grown shallow, the way she had looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only love, only the quiet certainty that she was leaving him behind, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. "Stay," she had whispered. "Promise me you will stay." He had promised, had held her hand and sworn that he would not disappear, that he would be there for Micah, that he would find a way to keep living even when living felt impossible. And then she had closed her eyes, and the machines had begun their terrible chorus, and Elias Vance had discovered that some promises were easier to make than to keep. He had lasted 11 months. 11 months of watching his son grieve, of seeing Catherine's face every time Micah smiled, of drowning in a house that still smelled like her perfume and echoed with the ghost of her laughter. 11 months of trying to be a father when he had forgotten how to be human. The note he left had been 3 words. "Do not look for me." He had meant it as mercy, had convinced himself that Micah would be better off without a father who was falling apart, that disappearing was the kindest thing he could do for a son who deserved more than a broken man who woke up screaming from nightmares he could not explain. 6 years later, sitting in the frozen darkness of a Montana mountainside, Elias understood that he had been lying to himself. He had not left to protect Micah. He had left because staying required courage he no longer possessed, because grief had hollowed him out until running was the only thing left that felt familiar. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph, holding it up to catch the faint light of stars that burned cold and distant above the peaks. Micah at 22, graduation day, wearing the cap and gown that Catherine had been so desperate to see. She had died 3 months before he walked across that stage. 3 months before Elias had taken this photograph and promised himself he would be there for every milestone that followed. He had broken that promise within a year. "I am sorry," he whispered to the darkness. To Catherine, to Micah, to the brother he had never reconciled with until it was too late. "I am so sorry." The wind carried his words away, indifferent to his grief, and Elias tucked the photograph back into his pocket with hands that trembled from more than cold. He had spent 6 years running from the wreckage of his life, convincing himself that he was too broken to matter, that the world was better off without Elias Vance stumbling through it. But his brother had forgiven him. After 40 years of silence, Hank had reached out with a letter and a cabin and a chance that Elias had not earned and did not deserve. And now there were men on that land who had turned his brother's sanctuary into a killing ground for their own amusement. Maybe this was not redemption. Maybe nothing could redeem the choices he had made, the promises he had broken, the people he had abandoned. But it could be a start. It could be the first step toward becoming someone worthy of the forgiveness his brother had offered from beyond the grave. The sky began to lighten in the east, gray bleeding into the darkness like watercolor on wet paper. Dawn was coming, and with it, the hunting party would wake, would resume their search for the vagrant who had stumbled into their operation. They would find him today. Elias would make sure of it, but not the way they expected, not as a homeless drifter to be intimidated or eliminated. They would find the wraith, and they would learn what happened to men who desecrated sacred ground. He rose from his position, joints stiff from the cold, and began to move toward the cabin. Below, the first sounds of activity drifted up from the clearing. Doors opening, voices calling, the hunt resuming. Elias smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. Let them come. They came for him with dogs. Elias heard them before he saw them, the baying of hounds echoing off the granite cliffs, the sound of men crashing through the forest with the confidence of predators who had never met anything they could not kill. He counted 3 dogs from the pitch of their voices, tracking breeds trained to follow scent through any terrain. Behind them, the heavier sounds of boots and bodies, at least 6 men spreading out in a search pattern that covered the eastern slope of the mountain. Garrett was not taking chances. The vagrant who had watched his operation had become a problem worth solving with maximum force. Elias had anticipated the dogs, had prepared for them in the hours before dawn, moving through the creek beds that laced the mountainside, crossing and recrossing the cold water until his scent trail became a maze of dead ends and false leads. The hounds would follow his path, but they would follow it in circles, buying him the time he needed to reach the cabin before the search party understood what was happening. He moved now with purpose, ascending the northern face of the ridge through terrain the hunters would consider impassable. Loose scree that shifted beneath his boots, requiring precise weight distribution to avoid a slide that would announce his position to everyone within a mile. Vertical rock faces that demanded the kind of climbing most men only attempted with ropes and harnesses. Elias climbed them with bare hands and the muscle memory of a body that had scaled worse obstacles under enemy fire. The cabin came into view as the sun crested the eastern peaks, its weathered logs glowing amber in the early light. The clearing below was empty now, the vehicles gone. The hunting party dispersed across the mountain in their search for him. Only one SUV remained, parked beside the cabin's front door, and beside it stood a single figure with a rifle slung across his back. Cade, the security team leader, had stayed behind, either to guard the base camp, or because some instinct told him that the vagrant they were hunting might circle back to the place that mattered most. Smart. Too smart to underestimate. Elias studied the man from his concealed position, reading the way Cade held himself, the patterns of his attention, the subtle signs that revealed his level of alertness. The security contractor was watching the tree line with genuine focus, his body positioned to respond to threats from multiple angles. But he was watching the wrong approaches, watching the paths a normal man would take. Not the cliffs, Not the impossible routes that only someone with decades of mountain warfare experience would even consider. The distance between Elias and the cabin was perhaps 200 meters. Open ground for most of it, exposed to Cade's sight line. A direct approach would be suicide, but Elias had not survived 30 years of combat by taking direct approaches. He waited. Patience was the sniper's greatest weapon, more valuable than any rifle, more deadly than any bullet. He waited until the sun rose high enough to cast long shadows from the cliffs, until Cade shifted his attention to check his radio, until the moment of opportunity opened like a door. Then he moved, 200 meters in 43 seconds, staying low, using every fold in the terrain, every shadow, every blind spot created by the cabin's geometry. Cade never saw him, never heard him, never knew that death had passed within arm's reach until Elias was inside the cabin and the door was closed behind him. The interior smelled of wood smoke and old paper, the scent of a life lived alone in the wilderness. Elias moved through the space quickly, cataloging resources with the efficiency of a man who had conducted 1,000 such assessments in hostile territory. 3 rifles on the wall, 2 bolt-action hunting models, and 1 lever-action carbine that looked older than he was. Ammunition in a locked cabinet beneath the window, the key hanging on a nail beside the door. A wood stove with enough fuel for a week. Canned food in a pantry that could sustain one man for a month. And on a small desk beside the bookshelf, something that made Elias stop moving entirely. A ham radio, old but functional, its power light glowing green in the dim interior. Beside it, a handwritten note in his brother's careful script. For emergencies, frequency is monitored by Willow Creek Fire Station. Ask for May. She is good people. Hank had prepared for this, had known that someday someone might need help from this remote cabin, and had arranged a lifeline that did not depend on cell towers or satellite coverage. Even in death, his brother was still looking out for him. Elias heard footsteps on the porch. Cade's voice calling out to someone on his radio. "I am checking the cabin. Thought I heard something. No time for the radio now." Elias melted into the shadows beside the door, his body falling into a stance he had practiced 10,000 times, weight balanced, hands ready, every muscle coiled for the violence that was about to unfold. The door opened. Cade stepped inside, rifle raised, eyes scanning the darkness. He was good. He swept the corners first, checked the blind spots with professional precision. But Elias was not in a corner, was not in any position a trained operator would think to check first. He was directly beside the door, in the narrow space Cade had already passed, invisible until it was too late. Elias moved. One hand caught the rifle barrel and forced it toward the ceiling. The other struck Cade's throat with precisely calibrated force, enough to stun, not enough to kill. The security contractor's eyes went wide with shock as his body crumpled, as his weapon was stripped away, as he found himself on his knees gasping for air, while a homeless man in torn clothes stood over him with the cold patience of a predator who had already decided to show mercy. "Who are you?" Cade managed to choke out, his voice raw and broken. Elias did not answer. He secured the man with zip ties from his own tactical vest, gagged him with a strip of cloth from the supply closet, and positioned him where he would be uncomfortable but unharmed. Then he returned to the radio and began to dial in the frequency his brother had left for him. The hunt was about to change direction, and Garrett Holbrook was about to discover that the vagrant he had dismissed was something far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The radio crackled to life on the 3rd attempt, static giving way to a voice that carried the weathered patience of someone accustomed to long silences. "Willow Creek Station, this is May. Who am I talking to?" Elias hesitated for just a moment, his hand resting on the transmitter. 6 years of hiding, of avoiding human connection, of convincing himself that he was better off alone. And now he was about to ask a stranger for help. "My name is Elias Vance," he said finally. "Hank Vance was my brother. He left me this cabin." The pause on the other end stretched long enough that Elias wondered if the connection had failed. When May spoke again, her voice had changed, softened with something that might have been recognition. "Hank told me you might call someday. Said his little brother was a hero who never believed it. Said you would need someone to tell you it was okay to rest. The words hit harder than Elias expected. His brother had spoken about him, had told strangers that he was proud of the man Elias had become, even while refusing to speak to him directly. 40 years of silence, and underneath it, something that had never stopped being love. "I am not looking to rest," Elias replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I have a situation here. Armed men have been using this property for illegal hunting. They're searching for me now with dogs and weapons. I need law enforcement." May's response was immediate and practical. "Nearest sheriff is 3 hours out on a good day, and the roads up your way are not good. Weather Service is calling for a front moving in this afternoon. Could be 6 hours before anyone reaches you. Maybe longer. Can you hold that long?" The question carried weight beyond its words. May was not asking if he could survive. She was asking if he was willing to fight. Elias looked around the cabin, at the rifles on the wall, at the ammunition in the cabinet, at the unconscious security contractor zip-tied in the corner. He thought about the men on the mountain with their dogs and their expensive weapons and their absolute certainty that they were the predators in this story. "Yes," he said. "I can hold." "Good. I will make the calls." "And Elias?" Hank said if you ever came home, I should tell you something. He said he was sorry. For all of it. For every year he wasted being angry instead of being your brother. The transmission ended before Elias could respond, leaving him alone with the static and the echo of words his brother had never been able to say directly. He stood motionless for a long moment, one hand still on the radio, feeling the weight of decades pressing against his chest. Then he heard the engines. 3 vehicles approaching from the logging road, moving fast. Garrett had recalled his hunting party. The search in the forest had failed, and now they were converging on the cabin with everything they had. Elias moved to the window, staying low, using the curtain's edge to observe without being seen. The SUVs pulled into the clearing in a spray of gravel and dust, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. He counted 7 men, the 4 clients and 3 security contractors, all armed, all focused on the cabin with expressions that ranged from nervous anticipation to cold determination. Garrett stepped out last, a satellite phone in one hand and a pistol in the other. His face had lost its casual arrogance, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The face of a man who was no longer playing games. "Cade, report." Garrett's voice carried across the clearing, sharp with impatience. "Cade, respond." Silence from the cabin. Garrett's expression darkened. He gestured to his remaining security team, and they began to spread out, taking positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire on the cabin's door and windows. The clients hung back, uncertain now, their enthusiasm for the hunt evaporating as they realized this was no longer sport. One of the contractors approached the SUV that Cade had been guarding, found it empty, and signaled to Garrett with a shake of his head. The message was clear. Cade was gone. The vagrant was inside. Elias watched Garrett process this information, watched the calculations happening behind his eyes. A different man might have recognized the danger, might have understood that someone capable of neutralizing a trained security contractor without a sound was not someone to underestimate. But Garrett was not built for retreat. His entire identity depended on dominance, on control, on the certainty that his money and his men could solve any problem. "I know you are in there." Garrett's voice echoed off the cabin walls, amplified by the natural acoustics of the clearing. "I do not know who you are or what you think you're doing, but this ends now. Come out with your hands up, and we can discuss this like civilized men. Stay inside, and my people will come in after you. Your choice." Elias did not respond. He moved away from the window, checking sight lines, calculating angles, preparing for what was coming. The cabin was defensible, but not indefinitely. Eventually, they would find a way in. Eventually, numbers would tell. But he did not need forever. He needed 6 hours. 6 hours until help arrived. 6 hours of holding a position against superior numbers. He had done it before. In Kinner Province, on a ridge that officially did not exist, against enemies far more capable than the men outside. He had held for 3 days that time, alone, with less ammunition and no hope of rescue until the helicopters finally came. This would be easier. These men were not insurgents. They were not trained for sustained combat against a prepared position. They were trophy hunters and hired muscle, accustomed to prey that ran and enemies that surrendered. They had never faced a wraith. Elias took position by the window, rifle steady, eyes cold. When the first contractor moved toward the door, he put a round into the ground at the man's feet. The crack of the shot echoed across the mountains, freezing everyone in place. His voice carried through the shattered silence, calm and certain. That was your only warning. The next man who approaches this cabin will not walk away from it. This is my land. This is my home, and I am done running. The standoff stretched into its second hour with neither side willing to make the first move. Garrett had pulled his men back to the tree line, using the vehicles as cover, while Elias maintained his position inside the cabin with the patience of a man who had once waited 4 days for a single shot. He used the time to fortify, push the heavy oak table against the back door, position the wood stove's iron grating as a barrier against the weakest window, distributed ammunition at strategic points throughout the cabin so he would never be more than an arm's reach from reloading. The movements were automatic, ingrained by decades of training, and as he worked, he found himself thinking about the last time he had prepared a position for defense. Khyber Province, September 2004. A ridgeline overlooking a valley where a firebase full of Marines was being overrun by a force that outnumbered them 5-1. He had been inserted alone, dropped by helicopter onto a peak that intelligence said was unoccupied. Intelligence had been wrong. He had spent the first 6 hours eliminating a forward observation post that nobody knew existed, and then he had settled into position and begun the longest 3 days of his life. 47 confirmed kills. He remembered every single one. The faces, the moments, the way bodies fell when life left them. He had not slept, had barely eaten, had fired until his rifle's barrel warped from the heat, and he had to switch to a weapon taken from a dead enemy. And when the helicopters finally came, when the firebase was evacuated and the Marines were safe, they had told him he was dead. Killed in action, the official report said. Posthumous Navy Cross, a star on a wall at Langley for operations that would remain classified for another 50 years. He had let them believe it, had welcomed the death of the man he had been, the legend that had grown too heavy to carry. Elias Vance, the Wraith, had died on that ridge. The man who walked away was someone else, someone broken, someone who no longer knew how to be anything but a ghost. A sound from outside pulled him back to the present. Movement in the tree line, figures repositioning. Garrett was getting impatient. Elias moved to the window, careful to stay in shadow, and watched as one of the contractors made a run for the cabin's eastern wall. He tracked the man's movement with the rifle, let him get within 20 feet of the structure, then put a round through the dirt at his boots. The contractor dove for cover, scrambling back toward the vehicles with a speed that suggested he had finally understood what he was dealing with. You cannot stay in there forever. Garrett's voice carried across the clearing, ragged with frustration. Sooner or later, you have to come out. And when you do, we will be waiting. Elias did not respond. Words were wasted energy. The rifle spoke clearly enough. But as the hours passed and the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, he found his thoughts drifting to places he had tried to keep locked away. To the photograph in his pocket, to the son he had abandoned, to the promise he had broken when Catherine died. He could leave. Even now, with Garrett's men surrounding the cabin, there were ways out. The cliffs behind a structure offered routes that no one would expect. He could vanish into the wilderness, disappear into another state, another city, another life spent running from everything he had lost. It would be easier, safer. The pattern he had followed for 6 years, repeated one more time. But he was tired of easier, tired of safer, tired of being a ghost who drifted through the world without touching anything, without mattering to anyone, without ever stopping long enough to feel the weight of what he had become. Hank had forgiven him. After 40 years of silence, his brother had reached across the divide they had built between them and offered grace that Elias had not earned. This cabin, This land, this last gift from a man who had spent decades being angry and had finally chosen love instead. If Hank could do that, maybe Elias could do something too. Maybe he could stop running. Maybe he could stand somewhere and say this is mine and mean it. Maybe he could become the kind of man who deserved the forgiveness he had been given. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph of Micah, studied his son's face in the fading light, wondered what kind of man Micah had become in the 6 years since Elias had walked away, wondered if there was still time to find out. The radio crackled. May's voice, urgent now. Elias, weather is moving faster than expected. Roads are getting bad. Sheriff says maybe 8 hours now, could be more. Can you hold? He looked at the photograph one more time, touched Catherine's ring through the fabric of his shirt, thought about all the promises he had broken and all the people he had left behind. Then he set the photograph on the table where he could see it and picked up the rifle. I will hold, he said into the radio, however long it takes. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the shadows began to grow. Garrett's men were moving again, preparing for an assault under cover of darkness. They thought the night would give them an advantage. They were wrong. The night had always belonged to the Wraith. They came at midnight. Elias had been expecting it. The darkness gave Garrett's men confidence they had not earned, the illusion that shadows would hide their approach. But Elias had spent 3 decades learning to see what others could not, to hear what others missed, to sense movement in the blackness the way a predator senses prey. He tracked them by sound first. Footsteps trying to be silent but failing, the rustle of fabric against brush, the soft click of a safety being disengaged. 3 men approaching from the east, using the vehicles as cover. 2 more circling from the north, moving toward the cliff face they assumed was unscalable. They thought they were being clever. They thought they were hunting. They were wrong. Elias waited until the eastern team was committed, until they had left the cover of the vehicles and were crossing the open ground toward the cabin. Then he moved. The first shot took the lead man's rifle clean out of his hands, the round striking the weapon's receiver with enough force to send it spinning into the darkness. Before the sound had finished echoing, the second shot punched through the dirt at the feet of the man behind him, close enough to spray debris against his legs. The third shot shattered the spotlight one of them was carrying, plunging the approach back into blackness. Panic erupted. Men screaming, diving for cover that was not there, firing blindly into the night at a target they could not see. Elias had already moved to a new position, sliding through the cabin's shadows like smoke, appearing at a different window to track the northern team. They had frozen at the sound of gunfire, pressed against the cliff face, suddenly aware that the darkness was not their ally. Elias could see them clearly in the starlight. 2 shapes tried to become invisible against stone that offered no concealment. He put a round into the rock 6 inches from the lead man's head. The impact sent chips of granite spraying across both of them, and they broke, scrambling back toward the tree line with the desperate speed of men who had finally understood what they were facing. In the clearing, Garrett was screaming orders that no one was following. His carefully planned assault had collapsed in less than 30 seconds. His men scattered and demoralized, his confidence crumbling like the granite he had thought would shield his flanking team. Elias allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Then he heard something that changed everything. The cabin's back door, the one he had barricaded with the oak table, was splintering inward. He spun, rifle coming up, just as the door burst open and a figure crashed through the wreckage. Cade, the security contractor, had freed himself somehow, had circled around while Elias was focused on the assault, had found a way through the defenses. The man was fast, faster than Elias had expected. He closed the distance before Elias could bring the rifle to bear, one hand catching the barrel and forcing it aside, the other driving a fist toward Elias's throat with killing intent. But Elias had been fighting before this man was born. He let the rifle go, using the sudden release to unbalance Cade, then stepped inside the man's reach where his size became a disadvantage. An elbow to the solar plexus, a palm strike to the jaw, a sweep that took Cade's legs out from under him and dropped him hard onto the cabin floor. Cade tried to rise, but Elias was already on him, one knee pinning his chest, one hand locked around his throat with precisely calibrated pressure. "Yield," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "This ends now." For a long moment, Cade struggled. Then something in his eyes changed. Recognition, finally, of what he was facing. Not a homeless vagrant. Not a lucky civilian. Something else entirely. "Who are you?" Cade gasped, the same question he had asked before, but different now. Desperate. Afraid. Elias considered the question. Considered the man beneath him, the ones outside, the choice that had brought him to this moment. For 6 years, he had hidden from the answer, had buried it under grief and guilt and the desperate need to disappear. But he was done hiding. "My name is Elias Vance," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every mile he had walked, every shot he had taken, every brother he had lost. 33.472 degrees north, 70.391 degrees east. Kidder Province, September 2004. Cade's face went white. "Operation Phantom Ridge," Elias continued, the words coming now like an avalanche, unstoppable. "One sniper position. 3 days. 47 confirmed kills. Firebase extraction under fire while I held the high ground against a company of insurgents." "That is impossible," Cade whispered. "That sniper died. They gave him a posthumous Navy Cross. He is on the wall at Langley." Elias released the man's throat and rose to his feet, stepping back with the fluid grace of a predator that no longer needed to prove its dominance. "The reports were wrong," he said simply. "I did not die on that ridge. I just stopped living for a while." He moved to the window, checking the clearing. Garrett's men had retreated to the vehicles, regrouping, licking their wounds. They would come again. They had no choice now. But when they did, they would come knowing what they faced. And that knowledge would destroy them. "Radio Garrett," Elias said without looking at Cade. "Tell him what I told you. Tell him who I am. And tell him he has one chance to take his men and leave this mountain before I stop showing mercy." Cade scrambled for his radio with trembling hands. And in the darkness outside, the balance of power shifted forever. The silence that followed Cade's radio transmission was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Elias watched from the window as Cade stumbled across the clearing toward the vehicles, his gait unsteady, his hands still shaking from what he had learned. The other contractors gathered around him, their weapons lowered, their aggressive postures replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Whatever Cade was telling them, it was spreading through the group like a virus. Garrett stood apart, satellite phone pressed to his ear, his face illuminated by the glow of the vehicle's interior lights. Even from this distance, Elias could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. The man who had commanded this operation with such casual arrogance was now speaking to someone in rapid, urgent tones. The clients had retreated to the far side of the clearing, huddled together like sheep who had suddenly realized they were in a field with wolves. Their expensive tactical gear looked absurd now, costumes worn by men who had never understood what real danger looked like. Elias allowed himself a moment to breathe. The immediate threat had passed, but the situation remained volatile. Garrett was not the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully. His entire identity was built on dominance and control, and Elias had just dismantled both in front of everyone he was supposed to impress. A man like that would either retreat completely or commit completely. There was no middle ground. The radio crackled. May's voice, strained with worry. "Elias, I have been monitoring their communications. They're talking about you. About Phantom Ridge. One of them is saying you cannot possibly be who you claim to be because that man is dead. But another one, the one called Cade, he is telling them about your tattoo. About the coordinates. He sounds terrified." Elias keyed the transmitter. What is Garrett saying? He is on the phone with someone. I cannot hear that conversation. But his men are arguing. Some of them want to leave. Others are saying they have too much invested, that they cannot let a witness walk away. How long until the sheriff arrives? Weather is getting worse. Could be dawn before anyone reaches you. Maybe later. Elias closed his eyes. Dawn was at least 6 hours away. 6 more hours of holding this position against men who were frightened enough to be dangerous. He had done more with less. But that was a long time ago, when he was younger and faster and had not spent 6 years letting his body deteriorate in shelters and under bridges. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night's confrontations was fading now, leaving behind the familiar ache of muscles pushed past their limits. Movement in the clearing drew his attention back to the window. Garrett had ended his call and was walking toward the cabin with slow, deliberate steps. His hands were empty, raised to shoulder height in a gesture of parley. Behind him, his men watched with expressions that ranged from confusion to relief. "I want to talk," Garrett called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "No weapons, just conversation. You have made your point. I am prepared to be reasonable." Elias did not trust the offer for a moment. Men like Garrett did not become reasonable. They became tactical. But the pause in hostilities served his purposes as well as theirs, buying time until help arrived. He moved to the door, opening it just enough to speak through the gap. "Say what you have to say." Garrett stopped 20 feet from the cabin, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to suggest he understood the danger. "My man Cade tells me you are someone special. Someone from the old days. He says you held a ridge alone against impossible odds, that you are one of the most decorated snipers in Marine Corps history. He says I have made a very serious mistake. Your man Cade is telling you the truth." Garrett nodded slowly, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "I am a practical man, Mr. Vance. I built my fortune by knowing when to press an advantage and when to cut my losses. Right now, I am looking at losses. Significant ones. My men are shaken. My clients are terrified. And I am standing in the dark negotiating with a ghost who should have been dead 20 years ago." He paused, and something shifted in his voice. "Something harder. But I'm also looking at a problem. You have seen my operation. You know my face, my name, my clients. You are a witness to activities that could destroy everything I have built. And I cannot allow witnesses." Elias felt the shift in the air before he saw the movement. Garrett's hand dropping to his side, the glint of metal appearing from beneath his jacket, the moment stretching into an eternity as instinct took over. The shot came from the cabin, from the rifle Elias had positioned beside the door for exactly this possibility. It struck the pistol as Garrett was raising it, sent the weapon spinning away into the darkness, left the man clutching a hand that would never grip anything the same way again. Garrett screamed, a sound of shock and pain and disbelief. Behind him, his men scattered, diving for cover, reaching for weapons they were suddenly afraid to use. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle steady, voice cold. "I gave you a chance to leave. You chose differently. Now your men will watch as I explain exactly what happens to people who threaten me on my own land." He walked toward Garrett with the measured pace of a man who had all the time in the world. And in the vehicles behind the fallen hunter, phones began to ring as someone, somewhere, realized that the situation in the Montana mountains had just become very, very complicated. Dawn broke over the Bitterroots in shades of gold and crimson, painting the snow-capped peaks with colors that seemed to belong to another world. Elias stood on the cabin's porch, rifle resting against his shoulder, watching the light creep across the clearing where Garrett's operation had finally collapsed. The night had ended not with violence, but with surrender. After Garrett fell, clutching his shattered hand and screaming for help that his men were too afraid to provide, the fight had simply drained out of them. One by one, the contractors had laid down their weapons. The clients had followed, stumbling forward with hands raised and voices babbling about lawyers and misunderstandings and how they had never meant for any of this to happen. Elias had secured them all with zip ties from their own tactical vests, lined them up against the vehicles, and waited for morning. None of them had tried to run. None of them had spoken beyond the occasional whimper or muttered prayer. They sat in the cold mountain air and contemplated the consequences of hunting a man who had been forged in places they could not imagine. The sound of helicopters reached him before he saw them, a distant thrum that grew steadily louder until 3 aircraft crested the eastern ridge and began their descent toward the clearing. 2 were marked with federal law enforcement insignia, their sides bristling with tactical officers in full gear. The third was unmarked, civilian in appearance, and something about the way it moved suggested whoever was inside had priority over everyone else. Elias did not lower his rifle as the helicopters landed. He had learned long ago that rescue and danger often arrived in the same package. The federal officers deployed first, spreading across the clearing with professional efficiency, securing the prisoners Elias had already gift-trapped for them. One of them approached the cabin with hands visible, voice raised to carry over the fading rotor noise. "Mr. Vance? We received a distress call, relayed through the Willow Creek fire station. I am Agent Reyes with the FBI. Are you injured? No. Are there additional hostiles we should be aware of? No. They're all accounted for." Agent Reyes nodded, her eyes scanning the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had walked into complicated situations before. Whatever she saw, it impressed her enough to keep her distance. The third helicopter had power down, and its door was opening. A figure emerged, moving with the careful deliberation of age, but carrying himself with an authority that made the federal agents instinctively straighten. He was tall, dark-skinned, his close-cropped hair gone silver at the temples, and he wore civilian clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform. He walked past the agents, past the prisoners, past the tactical officers securing the perimeter. His eyes were fixed on Elias, and there was something in them that looked almost like grief. He stopped 10 feet from the porch. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "I thought you were dead," the newcomer finally said. His voice was deep, roughened by decades of command. "Everyone thought you were dead. I spoke at your funeral, Elias. I folded the flag and gave it to a widow who was not actually a widow." Elias lowered the rifle for the first time since the helicopters appeared. He knew this man, had served under him in places that did not officially exist, on missions that would remain classified until everyone involved was dust. "Colonel Okonkwo," he said quietly. Raymond Okonkwo shook his head slowly. "Retired now. Have been for 8 years. But when May's transmission got relayed through channels, when someone at Langley heard the name Elias Vance and the words Phantom Ridge in the same sentence, calls were made. I was in Missoula for a veterans event, close enough to see for myself if the ghost had finally come home." He stepped closer, close enough that Elias could see the tears forming in the older man's eyes. 3 days on that ridge, Okonkwo continued. 47 confirmed kills. You saved an entire firebase, Elias. Saved men who went home to their families because you would not leave your post. And then you disappeared. Let us think you died. Let the world forget you existed. "I was not trying to be forgotten," Elias replied. "I was trying to stop existing." Okonkwo reached out and gripped Elias's shoulder with a strength that belied his age. "Well, you failed at that. You are very much alive. And from what I can see here, still very much capable of being the man I remember." He turned to survey the clearing, the bound prisoners, the scattered weapons, the evidence of a night that would generate reports for months. "What happened here, Elias? They were using my brother's land for illegal hunting. Trophy kills, making animals suffer for sport. They decided I was a problem that needed to be eliminated." Okonkwo's expression hardened. "And you decided otherwise." "I decided this was my home. I decided I was done running." The colonel nodded slowly, something like pride flickering across his weathered features. Then he reached into his jacket and withdrew a phone, holding it out to Elias with a gesture that carried the weight of significance. "There is someone who needs to talk to you," he said. "Someone who has been looking for you for 6 years. Someone who never stopped believing you were alive." Elias stared at the phone. His hand trembled as he reached for it. The voice that came through the speaker was older than he remembered, deeper, roughened by years. But he would have known it anywhere. Would have known it in the depths of hell or the heights of heaven. "Dad?" Micah, his son, the boy he had abandoned, the promise he had broken. Elias Vance, the wraith, the legend who had held a ridge alone against an army, felt his knees buckle and his vision blur with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in 6 years. "Micah," he whispered, "I am so sorry." The phone call lasted 43 minutes. Elias sat on the porch steps, phone pressed to his ear, listening to his son's voice for the first time in 6 years while federal agents processed the scene around him, and Colonel Okonkwo stood guard like a sentinel from another age. Micah did not yell, did not accuse, did not demand explanations that Elias could not give. He simply talked, filling the silence of 6 years with the details of a life his father had missed. The promotion at work, the apartment in Seattle with the view of the Sound, the woman he had been dating for 2 years, someone he wanted his father to meet, the way he had hired private investigators with money he could not afford, checking homeless shelters in every city Elias had ever mentioned, refusing to believe that his father was truly gone. "I knew you were alive," Micah said, his voice cracking on the words. "Mom used to say you were the most stubborn man she ever met. Said you would survive anything out of pure spite. I knew you would not just disappear." "I did disappear," Elias replied, the words tasting like ashes. "I left you alone. I broke every promise I made to your mother." "You did, and we're going to talk about that for a long time. But right now, I just need to know one thing." "What? Are you coming home?" The question hung in the cold mountain air, simple and impossible, and carrying the weight of everything Elias had been running from. Home. He had not had a home in 6 years, had not believed he deserved one, had convinced himself that the kindest thing he could do for the people he loved was to stay gone. But Hank had forgiven him. His brother, who had carried 40 years of anger, had found a way to let it go before the end, had left him this cabin, this land, this chance to stop running. Maybe forgiveness was not something you earned. Maybe it was something you accepted. "Yes," Elias said, and the word felt like the first breath after drowning. "I'm coming home." The sound Micah made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "I am flying into Missoula tonight. Colonel Okonkwo gave me the details. I will be there tomorrow morning. I will be here." The call ended, and Elias sat motionless on the steps, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the silence where his son's voice had been. Tears streamed down his face, cutting channels through the grime of 2 days without washing, and he did not try to stop them. Okonkwo settled onto the step beside him, groaning slightly as aging joints protested the movement. "He never stopped looking," the colonel said quietly. "I kept tabs on him after you disappeared. Watched him grow into the kind of man any father would be proud of. He has your stubbornness and his mother's heart. I do not deserve him. Probably not. But he is coming anyway. That is what family does." In the clearing, the federal agents were loading Garrett and his men into the helicopters. The hedge fund manager had stopped screaming hours ago, his shattered hand wrapped in field bandages, his face gray with shock and the dawning realization that his life as he knew it was over. The clients had already begun cooperating, falling over themselves to provide testimony in exchange for reduced charges. By the time the legal process finished, Garrett Holbrook would be fortunate to see the outside of a prison before he was an old man. Cade was the last to be loaded. He paused at the helicopter's door, turning to look back at the cabin where Elias still sat. Their eyes met across the clearing, and something passed between them. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but perhaps a kind of understanding. Cade raised his bound hands in something that was almost a salute. Then he disappeared into the helicopter, and the aircraft lifted off, carrying the wreckage of Garrett's empire into the morning sky. Agent Reyes approached the porch, tablet in hand, her expression a careful balance of professional neutrality and barely concealed awe. "Mr. Vance, I need to take your statement. But first, I've been asked to inform you that certain individuals in Washington are very interested in speaking with you. Apparently, your file has been flagged at multiple agencies for 2 decades. There are people who would very much like to know how a dead man ended up defending a mountain cabin against armed mercenaries." Elias looked at her with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by bureaucratic interest. "Tell Washington that Elias Vance is retired. Has been for 20 years. Whatever they want from me, they're not going to get it." Okonkwo chuckled beside him. "Same stubborn bastard you always were." Reyes nodded, making a note on her tablet. "For what it is worth, sir, I served 8 years in the Army. Did a tour in Afghanistan. I know what Phantom Ridge means to people who were there. It is an honor to meet you." She extended her hand, and Elias shook it, feeling the calluses that spoke of someone who had held weapons in places far from home. "Thank you for your service," he said. "Thank you for yours." She walked back toward the remaining helicopter, leaving Elias and Okonkwo alone on the porch of a cabin that had become something more than shelter. It had become a place worth defending, a place worth staying. Tomorrow, his son would arrive. Tomorrow, the long work of rebuilding would begin. Tomorrow, he would have to face the consequences of 6 years of running and all the pain he had caused. But today, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias Vance was not thinking about tomorrow as something to survive. He was thinking about it as something to hope for. 6 months later, the cabin had become something Elias never imagined it could be. The main structure remained largely unchanged, its weathered logs and stone foundation still standing against the mountain winters as they had for decades. But a new building rose beside it now, a guest house with 4 rooms and a common area, built by hands that had learned construction in the Seabees and perfected it in combat zones around the world. Veterans had come to help, men and women who heard through whispered channels that the Wraith was alive and building something worth believing in. They came and stayed. That was the part Elias had not expected. The first had been a young Marine named Esperanza, a scout sniper who had lost her spotter to an IED outside Fallujah and could not stop seeing his face every time she closed her eyes. She arrived at the cabin with a duffel bag and hollow eyes, speaking in monosyllables, flinching at sounds that reminded her of explosions. She stayed for 3 weeks, worked beside Elias in silence, splitting wood and clearing brush and learning to breathe again in air that did not smell like burning. On the day she left, she hugged him with a fierceness that surprised them both and whispered 2 words into his shoulder. "Thank you." Others followed. A Navy corpsman who had held dying men together with his bare hands and could not wash the blood off no matter how hard he scrubbed. An Army Ranger who came home to find his wife gone and his children afraid of the stranger he had become. A helicopter pilot who still heard the screams of soldiers she could not reach in time. They came to the cabin in the Bitterroots because word had spread through the veteran community that there was a place where broken warriors could rest. No paperwork, no programs, no demands, just mountains and silence and a man who understood what they carried because he carried it too. Elias did not counsel them, did not offer wisdom or solutions or the false promise that things would get better. He simply existed beside them, worked beside them, shared meals and sunsets, and the long, quiet hours of mountain nights. And somehow, in that presence, healing began. May came up from Willow Creek every few weeks, bringing supplies and news and the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of watching people struggle and survive. She had served as a combat medic in the First Gulf War, had seen things that still visited her in dreams, and she understood the cabin's purpose in ways that civilians never could. "You are building something important here," she told him one evening, watching the sun set behind the peaks. Hank would be proud. Elias touched the ring on the cord around his neck, Catherine's ring, and thought about all the people who had believed in him when he could not believe in himself. "I'm trying," he said. "That is all I know how to do." The sound of an engine drew his attention to the logging road. A truck was climbing toward the cabin, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. He recognized it immediately. The same truck that had arrived 6 months ago carrying a son who had refused to give up on his father. Micah stepped out with a woman beside him, tall and dark-haired, with kind eyes and a smile that reminded Elias painfully of Catherine. This was Elena, the woman Micah had been dating for 2 years, the woman he wanted his father to meet. She extended her hand as she approached, her grip firm and confident. "I have heard a lot about you, Mr. Vance." "Elias," he corrected. "And I suspect whatever Micah told you is exaggerated." She laughed, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the evening air. "He said you were humble." Apparently, he was not exaggerating that part. Micah wrapped his father in a hug that had become familiar over the past months, the easy embrace of a relationship slowly being rebuilt. They had talked for hours, over phone calls and visits, filling in the gaps of 6 years and excavating the wounds that had driven them apart. It was not easy. Some days, it was the hardest thing Elias had ever done. but it was worth it in ways that combat had never been. Colonel Okonkwo had arranged for Elias's records to be corrected, his death officially undone, his benefits restored. The Navy Cross that had been awarded posthumously was presented again in a small ceremony at the cabin, Micah pinning the medal to his father's chest while veterans from 3 generations stood at attention in the mountain clearing. Elias had not wanted the recognition, had tried to refuse it, but Okonkwo had insisted, and in the end, it was not about the medal. It was about being seen, being acknowledged, being welcomed back into a world he had tried so hard to leave. The evening settled into comfortable routine. Dinner around the long table in the guest house, stories shared between veterans old and young, laughter mixing with silence in the easy rhythm of people who understood each other without needing words. Later, after the others had gone to bed, Elias stood alone on the porch, looking up at stars that burned cold and eternal above the peaks. He thought about Catherine, about the promise he had broken and the one he was finally keeping. He thought about Hank, about 40 years of wasted silence and the gift that had brought him home. He thought about all the miles he had walked trying to disappear, and the strange grace that had led him here instead. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible, that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life that deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. Sometimes they're the ones who found the courage to stop running and start living again. Thank you for watching. The door opened behind him. Micah stepped onto the porch, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and settled into the chair beside his father. "You okay?" Elias accepted the coffee, warming his hands against the cup, feeling the presence of his son beside him like a gift he had not earned and would never stop being grateful for. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I finally am." The mountains held their silence around them, ancient and patient, keeping the secrets of all the broken things that had come here to heal. And in the cabin that his brother had left him, surrounded by the family he had almost lost and the purpose he had finally found, Elias Vance watched the stars wheel overhead and allowed himself to believe that some journeys ended not in darkness, but in light. "Still here, Catherine," he whispered to the night. "Still trying. And this time, I'm not trying alone.